If you ever understand a man like him, you don't walk away the same. The tray in my hands felt heavier than it should have. 12 crystal glasses trembling under the soft gold light of a ballroom I didn't belong in. My cheap heels sinking slightly into imported carpet that probably cost more than my rent for a year, and I kept my head down the way people like me learned to do. Invisible, quiet, replaceable, until the room changed without warning, not louder, not darker, just still, like the air itself had decided to wait, and I didn't need to look up to know why. Because everyone in Manhattan with money or fear knew that kind of silence meant one thing. He had arrived. Victor Hale. The name people didn't say too loudly unless they wanted to be heard by the wrong ears, and when I finally looked, just for a second, it felt like stepping into something I couldn't step out of. He stood near the center of the room in a perfectly tailored black suit, not moving much, not needing to, because the space around him bent without asking. Conversation softened. Laughter thinned. Even the music seemed to hesitate, and his eyes moved slowly across the room like he was taking inventory, not of people, but of choices, of risks, of who mattered and who didn't. And when those eyes passed over me, just for half a heartbeat, I felt it. Not fear exactly, something sharper, like being noticed when you had spent your whole life trying not to be. I dropped my gaze immediately, focusing on the table in front of me, on the exact placement of silverware, on anything. That didn't feel like falling into something deeper than I understood, because girls like me don't get involved in stories like his. We serve, we smile, we leave. That's the rule. That's survival. But then he spoke, and the sound of his voice didn't cut through the room. It settled into it, low, controlled, carrying just enough weight that everyone leaned in without realizing it. Except the words he used weren't English, not Spanish, not anything I'd heard in this city, and the room shifted. Again, confused this time, curious, people glancing at each other, waiting for someone else to understand first, and I felt it in my chest before I even processed the words. That quiet recognition I had spent years pretending I didn't have, because I knew that language, not from school, not from any safe place, but from nights I didn't talk about, from voices I learned to understand before I learned how to explain them, and my fingers tightened slightly around the tray. Just enough that one glass chimed softly against another, and I froze. Because I shouldn't know this, I shouldn't react, I should stay invisible. But his voice continued, calm, almost amused, and then he laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to signal that whatever he had said carried more weight than anyone else in the room could measure. I'll give you $10 million if you translate that, he said, switching back to English like it was nothing, like the first sentence had never mattered. And suddenly the room relaxed, laughter returning in soft waves, people smiling, shaking their heads, treating it like a game, like a rich man's joke. $10 million for words no one could understand, and I kept my eyes down, because this was the moment to disappear, to step back, to let someone else take the attention. But then I felt it again, that weight, not on the room, but on me, like a spotlight without light. And I knew before I looked that his eyes had stopped moving, that they were fixed, that they had chosen, and when I finally glanced up, just enough to confirm it, he was already looking at me, not guessing, not searching, knowing, like he had seen something in me. Long before I realized it myself, and the tray in my hands suddenly felt like the only thing keeping me grounded, because in that moment I understood something I didn't want to understand. This wasn't a random challenge. This wasn't a joke thrown into a crowded room. This was a test, and somehow, without meaning to, I had already been chosen to take it. The room did not breathe, it waited, and I could feel every second stretching tighter around me as Victor Hale kept his gaze locked on mine, not impatient, not demanding, just certain, like time itself would eventually bend in his favor. And that was somehow worse, because men who rush can be avoided, but men who wait already know the outcome. And I realized my mistake was not understanding him, it was letting him see that I did. The tray in my hands suddenly felt like evidence, like proof of something I had spent years hiding, and my first instinct was simple: step back, lower my eyes, pretend, survive, but my feet did not move, because there is a moment when running only confirms what someone powerful already suspects, and I knew if I turned away now, he would follow, not physically, but with questions, with attention, with a kind of interest that does not fade. So instead I stayed, just barely. just enough to remain part of the room and not the center of it. And I heard someone near him laugh again, trying to recover the mood, saying something about $10 million being a generous offer for a joke. But Victor did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the sound. He only tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to tell me he was waiting for a decision, not an answer, and my heart beat once, hard, then again, slower, steadier, because I understood something else now. This was not about the money, not about translation. This was about control, about who in this room could be moved and who could not. And somehow, without asking for it, I had stepped into the space where that question mattered. I placed the tray down carefully on the edge of the table, making sure the glasses did not make a sound, because silence was already too loud, and I straightened just enough to meet his eyes again, not boldly, not defiantly, but without shrinking, and that alone seemed to change something, not in the room, but in him, the faintest shift in his expression, curiosity sharpening into focus, as if I had just confirmed a theory he had not yet spoken out loud. "You heard it," he said quietly, not a question, and the words landed heavier than his earlier challenge, because now it was just us. Even with 100 people watching, even with the music starting again somewhere behind me, it felt like the entire room had been reduced to a single line between where he stood and where I did, and I should have denied it. That would have been the safe choice, the expected one. But safety has a way of disappearing the moment someone like him notices you. So instead I took a breath. Slow, controlled, the way I had learned years ago when speaking the wrong word could mean something very different than what was intended, and I answered. I heard enough. And that was when the room truly changed, not because of what I said, but because of what I did not say, the ambiguity settling like a weight no one else could quite name. I saw it in the faces around us. Confusion, interest, a flicker of tension that did not belong in a room built for comfort, and Victor's mouth curved. Slightly, not a smile, not amusement, something closer to recognition, like he had just found the one variable he had been testing for. He took a step closer, not invading, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance so his voice would not need to carry, and when he spoke again, it was softer, almost conversational, then translate it. And there it was, the moment I could not step back from anymore, the line that separated serving drinks from shaping outcomes, and I felt the weight of the original words in my mind, every syllable precise, deliberate, carrying meaning that went beyond language into intention, and I also felt something else, something I had not expected, a choice, not whether to speak, but how, because translation is never exact, it is interpretation, it is decision, it is power disguised as accuracy, and for the first time since I had stepped into this room, I understood that what I said next would not just be heard, it would be believed, and that belief would move people, shift alliances, change the direction of something already in motion, and Victor knew it. I could see it in the stillness of his posture, in the way he watched not just my face, but my breath, my hesitation, measuring not my knowledge but my intent, and I realized then that he was not testing whether I understood his words, he was testing whether I understood the weight of using them. And that was the moment everything narrowed into a single, irreversible choice, because once, speak, knowing that whatever came next would not just answer him, it would define me in a world I had never meant to enter. I let the silence stretch for half a second longer than necessary, just enough to make everyone lean in without realizing it, just enough to make my next words feel heavier than they should have been, and then I spoke, clear, steady, without raising my voice, translating his sentence almost perfectly, almost, because accuracy is not always truth, and truth is not always what people hear. He said the shipment will not arrive on Thursday. I paused, just a fraction, watching the ripple move through the room like a change in air pressure, subtle, but real. He said it will be delayed, because someone here cannot be trusted. And that was the moment everything shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. A man near the far side of the table stiffened, just slightly, his hand tightening around his glass. Another guest glanced sideways, quick and sharp, like a reflex they could not control, and the laughter that had filled the room only seconds ago disappeared without anyone acknowledging it, replaced by something quieter, something sharper, something that did not belong in a room built on appearances, and I felt it, the weight of what I had just done settling into place, because I had not lied, Not exactly. But I had chosen which part of the meaning to reveal, which part to leave buried. And that choice had turned a sentence into a signal. Victor did not react immediately. And that was how I knew I had not miscalculated. Because men like him do not rush to. Against the quiet. And several heads turned toward him without meaning to. The tension tightening for a single second before dissolving back into polite stillness. But it did not disappear. It lingered beneath the surface. Invisible. Waiting. And Victor took another step closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the presence of him without needing to look. Say it again, he said softly. And this time it was not for the room. It was for me, a test within a test, and I understood. What he was asking, not repetition, confirmation, consistency, because power does not come from one correct answer. It comes from holding the same answer when the pressure changes. I met his gaze, steady now. No hesitation left to hide behind, and I repeated the translation exactly as before, word for word, tone for tone, giving him nothing new to measure except the certainty in my voice. And something in his expression shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me that I had crossed whatever line he had drawn in his mind. And then, for the first time since he had entered the room, Victor Hale smiled, not widely, not warmly, but deliberately, like a decision had just been made. You did not just translate it, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. You chose how they would hear it. And the words settled into me with a weight that felt heavier than the tray I had been holding. Because he was right, and more importantly, he was the only one in the room who understood exactly how right he was. The music resumed somewhere behind us, conversation slowly picking back up, careful at first, then more confident as people convinced themselves nothing had really changed. But it had. I could see it in the way glances lingered a second too long, in the way voices dropped when certain names were mentioned, in the way the man who had stiffened earlier now avoided looking at anyone directly. And I stood there, no longer invisible, no longer just passing through, because in a room full of powerful people, I had just done something none of them expected. I had spoken and changed the direction of the moment. And Victor knew it. He stepped back slightly, just enough to create space again, but his attention did not leave me. What is your name? He asked, not as a courtesy, not as small talk, but as if the answer already mattered, and I hesitated for the first time since I had started speaking, because names are not just introductions, they are invitations, they are ways of being remembered, of being found again, and I understood now that whatever I said next would not stay in this room. It would follow me. Quietly, persistently, the way his attention already had. I drew a breath, steadying something that had begun. I paused, just long enough to acknowledge it without drawing attention, setting a glass down gently before answering. I chose the clearest meaning. And even as I said it, I knew it was not entirely true, but it was not entirely false either. And that is where the real power of language lies, in the space between what is said and what is understood, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the room continuing around us like we were standing just outside of it, and then he let out a, just opened where there had been none before. And sometimes, he added, his voice quieter now, they are kept close, and the words were not a threat, not a promise, just a possibility placed carefully between us, and I felt the shift again, deeper this time, because I understood what he was really saying, that what I had done could not be undone, that I had stepped into a line of sight that does not fade with time, and that whether I wanted it or not, I was now part of something larger than this room, larger than this night. And for a brief second, I considered stepping back, saying something that would reduce me again, make me smaller, less noticeable, but I knew it would not work, not now, not after this. So instead I held his gaze, just long enough to acknowledge the weight of what he had said, before lowering it slightly. Not in submission, but in control, choosing how much of myself to reveal and how much to keep. And that seemed to be enough, because he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if confirming a decision only he understood, and then he turned away, rejoining the room as if nothing had happened, conversations adjusting around him instantly, the illusion of normalcy rebuilding itself piece by piece. But I stood there for a moment longer, the tray in my hands suddenly feeling lighter than before, not because the glasses weighed less, but because something inside me had shifted, something that could not be returned to where it was. And as I moved again, in the subtle repositioning of bodies that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with awareness. And I understood that what I had said had not just passed through the room. It had stayed quiet, persistent, shaping how everyone now saw each other. And that was the kind of thing that did not fade when the music got louder. I reached for another empty glass, refilling it with steady hands, letting the familiar motion anchor me, because routine was the only thing that still felt untouched. But even that was thinner now, like a surface that could crack if I pressed too hard. And I kept my head down, not out of fear, but out of control, choosing when to look, when to engage, when to disappear just enough to observe without being drawn back in, because I knew he was still there, somewhere in the room, not watching constantly, not needing to, but aware. The way someone becomes aware of a new variable in a system they thought they already understood, and I told myself that. Something else, a man speaking to him in low tones, but I noticed the way the man's posture shifted, respectful, cautious, like every word was being weighed before it was said. And then Victor lifted his hand slightly, a small gesture that ended the conversation without needing explanation, and the man stepped away, leaving the space between us open, and only then did Victor look at me, directly, fully, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. "Walk with me," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, just a statement delivered with the kind of certainty that did not leave room for misunderstanding. And for a fraction of a second, I considered refusing, not because I thought it would change anything, but because I wanted to understand what that choice would feel like. But I already knew the answer. Refusal would not create distance. It would create focus. And that was not something I could afford. Not here, not now. So instead I nodded slightly, acknowledging the request without drawing attention, and fell into step beside him as he moved toward a quieter part of the venue. The shift in environment almost immediate. The music softer, the conversations more distant, the air less crowded, and it felt like crossing an invisible line between two versions of the same night, one where everything was performance, and one where things were decided. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, but intentional, like he was giving me space to realize exactly where I was. And then he stopped, turning just enough to face me, his expression composed, controlled, but sharper now, more focused than before. "You understood more than the language," he said. And it was not a question. It was a continuation, a thread he had already begun to follow. And I met his gaze, steady, aware of every word I chose next. Because I understood now that this conversation was not about what had happened. It was about what would happen next, and I realized something I could not ignore. The night had not moved on from me. It had simply led me here. The air felt different here, thinner, quieter, like every sound had to earn its place, and I stood just a few feet from him, aware of the distance, aware of how easily it could disappear if he chose to. Close it. But he did not move. He never moved unless it mattered. And that was the first thing I was beginning to understand about Victor Hale. Everything he did had intention, even stillness, especially stillness. And I let the silence sit for a second before answering, because rushing would only give him something to read. "Understanding is not the same as speaking," I said, keeping my voice even, not defensive, not offering more than necessary. And his gaze sharpened slightly, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, that I knew the difference, that I had chosen deliberately. And he took a slow breath, like he was adjusting something internally, recalibrating. "No," he said quietly. "But speaking is what changes things." And there it was again, not a warning, not a threat, just a statement of fact. And I realized that this conversation was not about whether I had understood him. It was about whether I understood what I had done by responding, because about the room behind us, no longer about the guests or the conversation that had started all of this. This was about something else entirely, something quieter, more deliberate, something that did not rely on an audience to exist. And that realization should have made me step back, should have reminded me of exactly where I stood in relation to him. But instead it did something else. It made everything clearer, because when you strip away the noise, what remains is intention, and his intention was not hidden. It was focused, directed, and now it was on me. "You work here," he said, not asking, just confirming what he already knew, and I nodded once, small, controlled. "Tonight," I replied, and that seemed to interest him more than it should have. his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if adjusting the frame of something he was looking at. Only tonight, he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, like he was testing the edges of that answer, measuring how temporary it really was. And I felt the question beneath the statement. Not where I worked, but why? Why someone who understood what I did would choose to stand in a place like this, carrying trays, staying unnoticed. And I held his gaze, letting that unspoken question sit between us, because answering it would mean revealing something I was not ready to give. And instead I said, some places are easier to observe from the edges. And that was the closest thing to honesty I could offer without stepping too far forward. And it was enough, more than enough, because something in his expression changed again, deeper this time, like a line had just been drawn connecting 2 points that had not been connected before. You are not meant for the edges, he said, and the certainty in his voice was not arrogant, not dismissive. It was precise, like he was stating something he had already decided. And I felt that settle into me in a way I could not ignore, because it was not about where I stood in the room. It was about where he believed I belonged. And that was a far more dangerous kind of attention. I exhaled slowly, steadying the shift I felt building under the surface, because I understood now that this was the moment where things either remained contained or moved forward into something else, something I could not control in the same way, and I chose my words carefully, deliberately. That depends on who is looking, I said, and his gaze held mine for a second longer, something unreadable passing through it before settling into something quieter, more certain, and then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if a decision had just been finalized. Then I will keep looking, he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight that felt heavier than anything he had said before, because they were not about this moment, not about this night. They were about what came next. And I understood then, with a clarity I could not ignore, that whatever I had stepped into was no longer contained within this room. It had extended beyond it, and so had his attention. His words did not feel like a conclusion. They felt like the beginning of something I had not agreed to but could no longer ignore. And for a second, I considered stepping back, physically, emotionally, creating distance the only way I still could. But distance only works when both people respect it. And nothing about Victor Hale suggested he operated within limits set by others. So instead I stayed where I was, letting the silence stretch just long enough to show I had heard him without confirming anything beyond that. And then I turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the room, grounding myself in something familiar, the low hum of conversation, the soft clink of glasses, the illusion of normalcy that still lingered like a carefully maintained facade. You are used to getting what you want, I said, my voice even, controlled, not challenging, but not yielding either, and I felt his attention sharpen again, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way I said them, without hesitation, without apology, and for a moment he did not respond, and that silence was not empty, it was active, like he was deciding which version of himself to answer with. I am used to recognizing what matters, he replied finally, and there it was again, that precise control, the way he reframed everything into something that aligned with his perspective. And I realized that arguing with him would not create space. It would only pull me further into whatever this was. So I shifted, instead, choosing a different angle. And you think I matter, I said, not as a question, but as a statement that left room for him to define it. And his gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, the weight of it deliberate. I think you changed something tonight, he said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, because he was not exaggerating, not dramatizing, just stating what he saw, and I could not deny it. I had felt it too, the shift in the room, the subtle realignment of attention, the way a single sentence had altered the direction of an entire conversation, and for a second, I let that settle, not resisting it, not accepting it fully, just acknowledging that it existed, and then I said, moments change all the time. And he shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. Not like that, he said, and there was something in his tone now, something quieter, more certain, like he was no longer testing me, no longer trying to draw something out, but confirming what he had already decided. And that was when I felt it, the shift in control, subtle, but real, because up until now, everything had been a reaction, his words, my answers, a pattern of cause and response. But this felt different. This felt like direction, like he was no longer asking who I was, but deciding where I fit, and that was something I could not allow without pushing back, even slightly. You are assigning meaning, I said, keeping my voice calm, measured, to something you do not fully understand. And for the first time since this conversation had started, there was a flicker of something unexpected in his expression, not irritation, not anger, something closer to intrigue, sharpened by the fact that I had not stepped back, that I had not accepted his framing of the moment, and he studied me again, more closely this time, like he was recalibrating, adjusting the way he saw me based on new information, and then he stepped closer, just enough to shift the balance of space between us, not overwhelming, not aggressive, but intentional, and his voice dropped slightly, lower, more focused. Then explain it, he said, and the words were simple, but the implication was not, because this was not a request for clarification, it was an invitation to define myself within his understanding, and I felt the weight of that, the risk of stepping further into something I could not easily step out of, and for a second, I considered deflecting, offering something vague, something that would keep me just outside the line he was drawing. But I knew that would not work, not with him, not now. So instead I chose something else, something that held truth without giving him everything. I listened, I said, steady, clear, and I chose what people needed to hear. And the moment the words left my mouth, I saw it, the shift, not in the room, but in him, something settling into place, something aligning, and his gaze did not soften, it did not harden, it focused, like a lens narrowing until only one thing remained in view. That is not what most people do, he said quietly, and I did not respond, because we both knew that, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had just been acknowledged without needing to be said again, and then, after a second that felt longer than it should have, he stepped back, creating space again, but not distance, not really, because the connection had already been established, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was closing one part of the conversation while opening another. Finish your shift, he said, and the words were not a dismissal, not a command, but something in between, something that carried expectation without explanation. And before I could respond, he turned away, re-entering the flow of the room as if this moment had been just another part of the night. But I stood there for a second longer, the echo of his words settling into me, because I understood now that this was not over, it had only paused, and when it resumed, it would not be on neutral ground. For a moment, I stayed exactly where I was, the sound of the room returning around me in soft layers, laughter rebuilding itself, conversations overlapping like nothing had happened, but I knew better now, because once something shifts beneath the surface, it does not settle back into the same shape, it only pretends to, and I picked up the tray again, not because I needed to, but because it gave my hands something to do, something steady, something familiar, and I moved back into the room. Step by step, letting the rhythm of service pull me forward, refill, nod, turn, repeat, each motion precise, controlled, but my awareness had changed, sharper now, wider, catching details I would have ignored before. The way two men near the bar spoke more quietly than before, the way one guest checked his phone twice in less than a minute, the way a woman across the room laughed just a little too quickly, like she was trying to smooth over something she could not name, and I understood that I was not the only one who had felt it, they just did not know why, and that was the difference. That was the line I had crossed. I knew what had caused the shift, and more importantly, I knew I had caused it, and that realization should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it settled into something else, something quieter, something that felt like clarity, because for the first time that night, I was not just reacting to what was happening, I was aware of it as it unfolded, and that awareness changed how I moved, how I spoke, how I held myself, not larger, not louder, just more deliberate, and I realized that invisibility is not about being unseen, it is about being unimportant, and I was no longer that, not to him, and that meant something whether I wanted it to or not. I reached the edge of the room again, setting the tray down briefly as I adjusted my grip, and that was when I felt it, not his presence this time, but the absence of it, the way the space he had occupied no longer held the same weight, and I looked up, just slightly, scanning without appearing to search, and I saw him across the room, speaking with someone else now, his posture relaxed, controlled, as if nothing had interrupted the flow of his evening. But I noticed the difference. The way his attention shifted just a fraction too quickly when something changed near me. The way his gaze returned without fully turning his head, subtle, almost invisible, but not to me, not anymore, and I understood then that his words had not been casual, that when he said he would keep looking, he meant it in the way someone like him means everything, consistently, quietly, without needing to announce it again, and for a second, I felt the weight of that, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that does not fade when the moment passes, and I asked myself the question I had been avoiding since this started: what happens next, not in the room, not in the night, but after, when the music stops, when the lights dim, when the roles people play here no longer apply? And I did not have an answer, but I knew one thing with certainty. This was not something that would stay contained within a single evening. Because attention like his does not end when the event does. It follows, it returns, it reshapes itself until it finds what it is looking for. And I exhaled slowly, steadying the thought before it could take hold of something deeper, because I could not afford to think too far ahead. Not yet. Not while I was still standing here, still part of the role I had come to play, and I picked up the tray again, moving forward, continuing the pattern, because finishing the shift mattered, not just because it was expected, but because it was the last piece of normal I could hold on to, and I moved through the remaining tables with the same measured precision, answering small requests, offering polite smiles, keeping my voice even, controlled, giving nothing away beyond what was required. But inside, something had shifted permanently, something I could not return to where it had been. And when I finally stepped back toward the service area, the edge of the room where the lights were dimmer, and the noise softened, I allowed myself one last glance across the space, just enough to confirm what I already knew. His attention was still there, not constant, not obvious, but present. And as I turned away, stepping into the quieter corridor that led away from the ballroom, I realized something that settled into me with quiet certainty. The night was ending for everyone else, but for me, it had just begun. The corridor felt colder than the ballroom, not because of the temperature, but because the noise had been stripped away, leaving only the quiet echo of footsteps and the distant hum of music bleeding through closed doors. And I let the tray rest against the service counter for a second longer than necessary, my fingers loosening around the edge as if I needed to remind myself that I was still here, still grounded in something real, because everything about the last hour felt like it had shifted the ground beneath me without moving anything I could point to. And I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, the way I had learned to do when too many thoughts try to surface at once. Focus on what is in front of you, not what might come next. Finish what you started. And I reached for the stack of clean glasses, aligning them with deliberate precision, letting the small, repetitive motion anchor me. Because routine is the only thing that does not ask questions. It does not care who is watching or why. It just exists. And for a moment, that was enough, until it was not. Because even here, even in the quiet, I could feel it, that same awareness that had followed me out of the room. Not a presence exactly, not footsteps or sound, something less tangible, like a shift in focus that had not been released. And I told myself it was just the aftermath of the night. Just my mind catching up to what had happened. But I knew better, because this was not uncertainty. This was recognition, the kind that does not fade when you leave a room. And I straightened, picking up the tray again, turning toward the exit that would take me out of the service area and into the hallway leading to the staff entrance. The part of the building that did not carry the weight of chandeliers and polished marble, just clean lines, neutral colors, spaces, designed to move people in and out without being noticed. And I walked that path slowly, not hesitating, not rushing, just steady, each step measured, controlled, because I understood now that how I moved mattered just as much as what I said. And when I reached the end of the corridor, pushing open the door that led to the back hallway, I felt it again, stronger this time, not imagined, not residual, but present, and I stopped, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge it, before turning, slightly. And there he was, not close, not imposing, just standing a few feet away as if he had always been there. As if this moment had been waiting instead of arriving. And for a second, neither of us spoke, the quiet settling between us in a way that felt entirely different from the silence in the ballroom. This was not about performance, not about observation. This was direct, intentional, and I realized something in that instant that settled into me with unsettling clarity. He had not followed me, not in the way people usually do. He had anticipated where I would be, and that was a different kind of attention entirely. "You leave early," he said, his voice low, even, as if we were continuing a conversation that had never actually ended, and I held his gaze, steady, not surprised, because surprise would only give him something to read, something to measure. "I finished what I was asked to do," I replied, and the words felt simple, grounded, something that belonged to the version of me that existed before tonight. And for a moment, that seemed to hold the space between us neutral, balanced, until it did not, because he stepped closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to shift it, enough to make the air feel different again, more focused, more precise, and his gaze did not waver, not even slightly. "And what you were not asked to do," he said quietly, "you did anyway." And there was no accusation in it, no judgment, just recognition, and that made it heavier, because it meant he was not trying to define my actions. He was acknowledging them as they were, and I felt that settle into me. The weight of being seen without interpretation, without distortion, and I took a slow breath. Steadying the shift I felt building again, because this was no longer about the room, no longer about the moment. This was something else, something that extended beyond both, and I answered carefully, choosing each word with intention. Sometimes what is not asked matters more. And the silence that followed was different this time. Not a pause, not a test, but something closer to agreement, and I saw it in the way his expression changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to tell me that I had stepped further into whatever this was without stepping back. And then he did something I did not expect, something small, almost insignificant, but deliberate. He reached into his jacket, not quickly, not abruptly, just a smooth, controlled motion. And when his hand came back, there was a card between his fingers, simple, understated, no flourish, no excess, just a name and a number. And he held it out, not forcing it into my space, just offering it, as if the choice was mine. And I looked at it for a second longer than I should have, because I understood what it represented, not just contact, not just access, but continuation, a line that extended from this moment into something undefined, something that would not be limited to a single night. And my hand hesitated, just briefly, before I reached out and took it. The motion controlled, deliberate, because refusing would not end this, it would only reshape it. And accepting it did not mean I had agreed to anything beyond that moment. And his gaze followed the movement, not the card, but my hand, my choice. And when I looked back up, he was already watching me, not waiting, not expecting, just observing. And then he nodded once, slow, final, like something had just been set in motion. "Good night, Emily," he said, and this time it sounded different. Not like a farewell, but like a beginning. The card felt lighter than it should have in my hand. Just a small piece of paper, smooth edges, clean design, nothing about it suggesting weight or consequence. And yet I could feel it, not physically, but somewhere deeper, like holding a decision that had not fully formed yet. And I did not look at it immediately, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood that looking would make it real in a way that simply holding it did not. And I stayed where I was for a second longer after. He turned away, the quiet of the hallway settling back into place as if nothing had interrupted it, as if this space had not just become something else entirely. And then I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, before sliding the card into the pocket of my apron, not carefully, not dramatically, just a simple motion, because sometimes the most important choices are made without ceremony. And I turned back toward the exit, pushing the door open and stepping into the night air, the shift immediate. Cooler, cleaner, free from the controlled environment inside. And for the first time since the evening began, I felt something loosen slightly, not relief, not entirely, but distance, the kind that comes from stepping outside of something intense, even if it has not fully let go of you yet. And the street was quieter than I expected, a few cars passing, distant city sounds blending into a steady background hum, the kind that does not demand attention. And I walked toward the corner where the staff usually gathered before heading home, my steps measured, unhurried, because rushing would not change anything, and I needed the time, not to think, but but to let everything settle into something I could understand. And I reached the curb just as a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the sidewalk. And in that moment, I saw my reflection in the glass of a nearby window, not clearly, just enough to recognize the outline, the posture, the way I held myself, and something about it felt different, not drastically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I did, because I knew what had shifted beneath it, and I looked away before the thought could take shape, because naming it would only make it harder to ignore, and I reached into my pocket without thinking, my fingers brushing against the edge of the card, and this time I did take it out, holding it between my fingers, turning it slightly under the streetlight, simple, understated, just his name, Victor Hale, and a number beneath it, no title, no explanation, nothing extra, and that simplicity made it feel more deliberate, not less, because it assumed I already knew what it meant, and in a way, I did, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that this was not just contact. It was access, a door that had been opened without being pushed, and I could close it, ignore it, walk away, but I also knew something else. Doors like this do not stay open forever, and if they close, they do not always open again. And I stood there for a second longer, the city moving around me, people passing, cars driving by, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, and I wondered, briefly, what it would look like to go back to that, to let this night remain exactly what it was supposed to be, a shift, a job, something that ended when I stepped outside. But the thought did not hold, because I knew it was not true, not anymore, and I slipped the card back into my pocket, this time more deliberately, as if acknowledging what it represented instead of pretending it was just another object, and I started walking again, away from the building, away from the light, letting the distance build slowly, step by step, and I told myself I would think about it later, that there was no decision to make right now, no action required, just time. But even as I thought it, I knew that was not entirely accurate, because the moment I took the card, I had already made a choice, not about what I would do next, but about whether I would allow this to continue, and I had not stopped it, and that was enough. And as I turned the corner, the building disappearing from view behind me, I felt something settle into place, not fully, not permanently, but enough to recognize. This was not something I had been pulled into, it was something I had stepped into, one decision at a time, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to consider the question I had been avoiding, not what he wanted, not what this meant to him, but what it meant to me, and I did not have an answer yet. But I understood something that mattered more, whatever came next, it would not be by accident. I did not go home right away, and that was the first decision I noticed, not the big ones, not the obvious ones, but the quiet shift in direction, the way my steps slowed instead of continued, the way I turned down a street I did not usually take, as if I needed more time between where I had been and where I was supposed to be, and the city at this hour felt different, not empty, but less demanding, like it allowed space for thoughts to settle without interruption, and I walked without rushing, my hands tucked into my coat pockets, the card still there, a small, constant presence I could not ignore even when I was not touching it, and I let the silence stretch around me, not filling it, not distracting myself, because I understood that whatever this was, it would not be resolved by avoiding it. And after a few blocks, I stopped at a crosswalk, the light red, the street quiet, and I looked up, not at anything specific, just letting my focus drift, and that was when the question finally formed clearly, not what happens next, but why me, and I stood there for a second longer, letting it settle, because it was not insecurity, not doubt, it was curiosity, the kind that comes from recognizing that something does not fit the pattern you are used to. And I replayed the moment in my mind, the sentence, the choice, the shift, the way he had looked at me after, not like someone surprised, but like someone who had found what he was already looking for, and that was what stayed with me, not the attention itself, but the intention behind it, because he had not reacted to me, he had identified me, and that meant this was not random, not entirely, and the light changed, green, but I did not move right away, because I understood something else now, something I had not fully acknowledged before. This was not just about him choosing to notice me. It was also about me not stepping away when I could have, about every moment I had answered instead of deflected, about every time I had held his gaze instead of lowering it, and I crossed the street slowly, that realization settling deeper with each step, because it shifted the perspective. It was not just his decision, it was mine too. And that made it more complicated, more real. And when I reached the other side, I pulled the card out again, this time without hesitation, holding it up under the streetlight, reading the name once more, Victor Hale, and the number beneath it, and I traced the edge of it with my thumb, not nervously, just thoughtfully, because this was the point where things either stayed as they were or changed, not because of him, but because of me. And I asked myself the only question that mattered now, not whether I could call, but whether I would. And I stood there for a second longer, the city moving around me, distant sounds blending into something steady and constant. And I realized something that felt both simple and complicated at the same time. I did not need to decide tonight. Not completely, but I had already decided something more important. I had not walked away, and that meant I was not trying to close the door, and I slipped the card back into my pocket again, this time with intention, not avoidance, and I started walking once more, my pace steady, my thoughts quieter now, not because they were resolved, but because they had shifted into something clearer. And as I turned onto the street that led toward my apartment, the familiarity of it grounding me in a way the rest of the night had not, I felt something settle into place, not certainty, not yet, but direction. And I understood that whatever this was, whatever it became, it would not be something that happened to me. It would be something I chose to step into, fully, deliberately, one decision at a time. And that thought stayed with me as I reached my building, as I climbed the stairs, as I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the quiet of my apartment wrapping around me in a way that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. And I stood there for a moment, the night still lingering just beneath the surface, and I realized that even here, even in a space that had always been mine, something had shifted, something that would not return to what it was before. And I reached into my pocket one more time, pulling out the card and placing it on the table by the door, not hidden, not tucked away, but visible, intentional. And as I looked at it, I understood something with quiet clarity. This was not the end of the night. It was the beginning of a choice I had not fully made yet. I did not turn on the lights right away, and that was the second decision I noticed, small, quiet, but intentional, because the dim outline of the room felt easier to stand in than the clarity that would come with full brightness. And I stayed by the door for a moment, listening to the silence settle around me, not empty, but steady, familiar in a way that grounded me after everything that had shifted tonight. And my eyes adjusted slowly, picking out the shapes I already knew, the table by the door, the chair near the window, the faint reflection of the city lights filtering through the glass. And then my focus returned to the card where I had placed it, simple, unmoving, exactly where I left it. And I stepped toward it without thinking, my movements slower now, more deliberate, because I understood that this was not about urgency. It was about clarity, and I rested my fingers lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the card yet, just close enough to feel its presence. And I asked myself something different this time, not whether I should call, not whether I wanted to know what came next, but what it would mean if I did nothing, if I let this moment stay contained within the night it belonged to. And I stood there, letting that version play out in my mind, the days continuing as they had before, the routine unchanged, the edges of this night softening over time until it became just another memory, something unusual but ultimately distant. And for a second, that felt possible, even reasonable. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me, not surprised, not uncertain, but certain, like he had already accounted for the possibility that I would not walk away. And that realization shifted something again, because it meant that doing nothing was still a choice, still a response, still part of the pattern that had already begun. And I exhaled slowly, my fingers finally brushing against the card, lifting it slightly from the table, turning it between my fingers as if the motion itself might reveal something I had not seen before. But it did not. It remained exactly what it was, a name, a number, an open line. And I walked further into the apartment, the soft creak of the floor grounding me with each step, until I reached the small kitchen counter, placing the card down. Again, this time closer, within reach, not at the edge of my space, but inside it. And I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms loosely, letting the quiet stretch again, not avoiding the decision, just allowing it to settle into something I could understand without forcing it. And that was when I realized something that had been there all along. just beneath the surface. This was not about him offering me something. It was about recognizing something I already had, the ability to see, to understand, to choose how information moved through a room. And I had spent years keeping that small, controlled, used only when necessary, only when safe. And tonight I had done the opposite. I had used it in a space where it carried weight, where it changed things. And more importantly, I had not stepped back after. And that was what stayed with me. Not the offer, not the attention, but the fact that I had not tried to undo it, and I looked down at the card again. The simplicity of it almost understated compared to what it represented, and I reached for my phone without thinking, not immediately unlocking it, just holding it, feeling the familiar weight in my hand. The contrast between something I used every day and something entirely new, and I let the silence sit for one more second, just enough to make sure I was not reacting, not being pulled, but choosing. And then I unlocked the screen, the light filling the room just slightly, enough to sharpen the edges of everything around me, and I entered the number slowly, each digit deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, and I paused before pressing call, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this was the moment where possibility became action, where everything that had been building quietly would take shape, and I took a breath, steady, controlled, and pressed the button, holding the phone to my ear as the line rang. Once, twice, the sound measured, consistent, and for a brief second, I wondered what I would say, not the words themselves, but the tone, the intention behind them, because this was not a conversation that would follow any familiar pattern. And then the line connected. The silence on the other end immediate, intentional, and I spoke before the moment could stretch too far, my voice calm, even, carrying none of the uncertainty that had led me here. "This is Emily," I said, and there was a pause, not long, not empty, but deliberate, and then his voice, just as controlled as before, just as certain. "I was expecting your call," and that was when I understood something with complete clarity. This was never about whether I would reach out. It was about when. His voice did not surprise me, and that was the first thing I noticed, not the words themselves, but the way they settled into place like they had been waiting, like this moment had already been accounted for long before I stood in my kitchen, holding a phone to my ear, and I leaned slightly against the counter, grounding myself in something solid as I let the silence stretch just enough to acknowledge what he had said without rushing to respond. Because this was not a conversation that needed speed, it needed control, and I exhaled quietly before answering. "You sound very certain," my voice steady, even, not challenging, but not yielding either, and I could almost hear the shift on the other end, not in sound, but in presence, like his attention had sharpened slightly, focusing in a way that did not require proximity to feel. "I am," he replied, just as calmly, just as precisely. And there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just a statement that existed on its own without needing reinforcement. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet between us not empty, but intentional, like both of us were measuring the space before deciding how to move within it. And I realized something then, something that had been building since the moment I dialed the number. This was not about introductions, not about explanations. This was a continuation. A thread that had already been set in motion and was now simply being followed. And I shifted slightly, my fingers resting against the edge of the counter as I let my focus settle, not on the room around me, but on the conversation itself. "You gave me a choice," I said, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than they appeared to, because they acknowledged the card, the call, everything that had led to this point. And there was a pause on the other end, not long, not uncertain, just deliberate. "I gave you an opportunity," he corrected, his tone unchanged, controlled, but there was something in it now, something sharper, more defined, like the conversation had moved into a space he was more familiar with, and I considered that for a second, letting it settle before responding, because the distinction mattered. Choice implies distance, space to step away. Opportunity implies direction, something that moves forward whether you follow it or not, and I understood then that this was where the line between us existed, not in what had happened, but in how we defined it. "Those are not the same thing," I said quietly, and the silence that followed was different this time. Not a pause, not a test, but something closer to acknowledgement. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle shift, not softer, not louder, just more focused. "No," he said, "they are not." And that was the first time since the call began that it felt like we were not just speaking, but aligning, not in agreement, but in understanding, and I felt that settle into place with a clarity that made everything else feel secondary. Because this was the foundation of whatever came next, not control, not dominance, but awareness. And I straightened slightly, my grip on the edge of the counter loosening, as I let that realization take shape. "Then what exactly are you offering?" I asked, and the question was direct, but not confrontational. It did not demand, it clarified, and on the other end, there was a brief pause, longer than before, as if he was considering not what to say, but how much to say. And when he answered, his voice was the same as it had been all night, controlled, deliberate, but there was something else in it now, something that had not been there before, something closer to honesty, perspective, he said, and the word landed quietly, almost understated, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it did not promise anything concrete. It did not define a role or an outcome. It simply opened a door, and I felt that, the subtle shift in the conversation, the way it moved from something structured into something less defined, more open, and for a second, I did not respond. Not because I did not understand, but because I did, and that understanding required a different kind of answer, not immediate, not reactive, but deliberate, and I let the silence hold just long enough to make that clear before I spoke again. "And what do you expect in return?" I asked, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a single word, delivered with the same precision as everything else he had said. "Nothing." And that should have felt like the end of it. The simplicity of the answer, the absence of demand, but it did not, because I knew better, because nothing is never just nothing, not in a world like his, not in a conversation like this. And I felt something shift again, deeper this time, not in the room, not in the call, but in myself, because I understood now that this was not about exchange, not in the way I had expected. It was about something else entirely, something that did not rely on immediate return, but on something that built over time, and I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, letting that realization settle before I responded. "That is not how this works," I said, and for the first time since the call began, there was something that might have been a quiet laugh on the other end, not loud, not obvious, just a subtle shift in tone. "It is now," he replied, and the certainty in his voice did not feel imposed. It felt established, like he was not changing the rules, but revealing them. And I stood there for a second longer, the phone still pressed to my ear, the quiet of my apartment surrounding me. And I realized something with complete clarity. This was not a conversation that would end tonight. Not really. It was something that had just begun to take shape. And as I looked down at the table where the card had been, now empty, I understood the truth of it in a way I could not ignore. I had not just answered his call. I had stepped into his world, and the most dangerous part was not that he had invited me. It was that I had walked in on my own.